Welcome everybody to Bobby Talks. ... Those dots are there to tell you that there's always more to the story. And today's story, well, it's that of a sad one. I'm sitting here with Dr. Jens Alex Rush, aka Alex Rush of Madison, Wisconsin. She is an attending psychiatrist out of Madison, Wisconsin, of the Bellin Health. I want to make sure I say that. Bellin Healthcare. It's one of the two, Bellin Health or Bellin Healthcare, but she is an attending psychiatrist, and I'm very, very fortunate to have her on the show today. We're going to be talking and diving into the world of grief. Alex, how are you?
Yes, I'm good. Happy to be here. Thank you for having me.
I really, really appreciate you being here. It's going to be a conversation, I think, for all in some semblance of some way. I think we've all kind of experienced this. I must admit, at 35 years of age, this is my first kind of go around with it, which is new. And it's kind of exposed a lot of vulnerabilities for me. And for those of you that don't know, I just lost my grandfather, and I've been kind of battling with that as of late, mainly because he was my father, Alex. He stepped up in a big way when I was born, when my father decided that he could not be there for us or for me. And he just kind of, he did what you selflessly do. You just put yourself in a position, you take care of a kid. Most grandfathers don't take on that challenge. He did, and I'm forever grateful for it. But in your world as a psychiatrist, I'm sure you've had this conversation 1,000 times. How comfortable are you on the topic? How personal is it to you? How do you feel when I just say the word grief? What comes to your head?
Well, first, I'm so sorry for your loss. That's a huge loss. And, grief is a huge component of a lot of psychopathology that I work with. And what comes to my mind with grief is that it's so variable, and everyone's experience with grief is unique. And so, the media has a good way of portraying what grief should look like. And it can create a lot of confusion and other issues for people if they don't experience grief the way that they, quote unquote, are supposed to. And so grief is this really broad topic for such a short word, but it can mean a lot, and a lot of different things for people depending on stages of life, the particular loss that they experience, and a lot of other factors. It can look a lot different throughout the course of someone's life.
Yeah, you touched on something that was really interesting. Actually, was that the way the media portrays grief, and I I always feel like the way media portrays grief up until this point, it was always kind of like neatly and nicely packaged, and there's a nice bow on it at the end. There's a sense of closure, and then it's gone, right? And
Absolutely.
we move
Yep.
on. And from what I'm understanding, and again, I'm not going to be somebody who tries to stand up here and say that I understand the longevity of this thing. I'm kind of being crumbled with the feeling of this is my next 30, 40 years. And that's suffocating. Um, but it's very real, right? It's not something that comes with a bow. It's not something that is going to have closure ever. It's something that I had an uncle told me the night that it happened, that it's just something we endure,
Mm.
and you survive with it. And I just thought that was I didn't really understand it in that moment, but every single day it kind of becomes more and more prevalent in my life. um, so you're right, that's such an interesting take, is the way the media portrays things, because it's not necessarily the case, right? That's not necessarily the
Exactly.
case. And in your case, how do you find it challenging trying to have these conversations with I want to make sure I use the correct term. Is it patience? Is it what's the
Patience,
correct
yes.
term? Patience. Okay.
Patience. Yeah.
Do you find it frustrating since there's not kind of a one size fits all?
Frustrating. It's interesting to think of it as frustration because I think a lot of grief has an element of frustration to it. And yeah, I would say that I think the grieving process and to go through that with somebody can be frustrating at times because you want the pain to stop. Um, I think the feeling I have going through the process with my patients or talking about the process with my patients is more um, trying to not have any expectation of them and trying to help them not have any expectations of themselves of what this process will look like, and to kind of accept, and acceptance is one of the stages of grief that we all talk about, those stages of grief, but accept that grief will happen and it'll happen in its own pace, in its own way. And that, I think, is a source of frustration, but also some source of calmness that can be present with this process, if that makes sense, where you accept that what will happen, and that you kind of go with the process. And I think that that's the most healthy way to process grief, is to kind of accept it as a process rather than something that has a beginning and an end point, and then all of a sudden you kind of wash your hands of it and move on, because that just isn't reality and it's not realistic.
Yeah. Process is, excuse me. Process is a huge part of that. You're right.
Hmm.
It's an ongoing journey. It will always be that way. Um, but I guess in your field, trying to you're not so much giving advice as you are listening. Is that right? Is that correct to say it like that? Or do you find your times?
No, I
Do
mean,
you?
it's both. I mean, I do a fair share, and I tend to try to, um I don't like to give unsolicited advice, I guess, but I do try to throw in any sort of personal relation that I can have to the topic I'm talking about, and to offer an alternative way to cope with something. So I think that that's kind of how I phrase, or I kind of couch my advice as more of an alternative option. But yeah, I do both. I would listen a lot, and then I also try to give the best advice I can.
Yeah, that's okay. Good. I'm glad to hear that because sometimes it feels like it's like I'm drowning here. Somebody throw me a life preserver. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
Give me
absolutely.
something. I don't know. Well, let me ask you this. I don't want to get so well, this is, I mean, we're talking grief.
Go
How
for
can you
it.
not
Yeah,
get personal, right?
go for it.
Alex, have you ever experienced a loss of great magnitude in your life specifically?
I have, yeah. I think the losses that I experienced, the biggest one I think in my life was my parents divorced when I was really young, and this wasn't typical, like, or common for the time. But my father raised my brother and I, and my mother left, and that was a huge loss for me. That I didn't really realize how big that loss of losing my mom would be, until I got older. But I
How old
think
were
that
you when that happened?
I was, let's see, 5.
Okay. Old
Yeah,
enough
I
to
was
know. Yeah.
old enough to know, but not fully understand. And there was a lot of anger that came along with that, and another stage of grief. But anger was a big one that I struggled with, and that carried through my teenage years, into my young adulthood. And I think that that shaped my way of coping a lot, and shaped my way of kind of looking at grief. But as I've gotten older, as the years have progressed, I've had a lot of other losses, and I think I've coped with each of them differently. I had my grandfather, also passed away last year, and that was a different loss, because I was grieving the fact that I never really got to know him on a deeper level that I wanted to, because of my parents' divorce. So it was, I was grieving his actual death, but also the loss of a potential relationship and support system. And I just had a son last February, and I always had this image of what family would mean once I have children. And, to have one of my grandparents not be present was not the way that I envisioned it. So it was also that type of loss of what a family structure would be. So there was a loss on many levels, which I think is also part of grief. Is it's complex, it's not simple, and there's many layers to the grieving process. And even a death, or a loss of someone that you love or care about, even with that, there's many layers in what that loss means, to the family,
Yeah,
to
I was just gonna go there. I'm so glad that you kind of structured it this way. Is that it doesn't always have to necessarily be an actual death of
hmm
somebody, but it's the idea of it's almost like a symbolic death,
Yeah,
that
absolutely.
you're now suffering from, or you're grieving from. In your case, at 5, not understanding the full extent of your mother leaving. Um, in your eyes, she might as I don't mean this to come out as frank as it's going to be, but she might as well been dead because she doesn't exist in your presence anymore, and that is a loss of um, a power status of some sort in your life that was always there prior. So I'm just glad that you touched on multiple different forms. You lost this idea of family,
Hmm.
um, and it's almost like it compounded itself during that time because you lost
Absolutely.
the actual man, but then you lost this idea of what you wanted it to look like for you and now your son. And congratulations, by the way.
Thank you.
How old
Thank
is your
you.
son?
So he will be 11 months tomorrow. So it's a big one.
And
Yeah.
when did you lose your grandfather?
He passed Thanksgiving.
Of this year?
Um,
Or I mean
Last year,
2021 or 2020?
2020. Yeah. So I was
Okay.
pregnant with my son at the time. Yeah.
Okay, so right before then. Okay.
Hmm.
How has having your child, your son, helped your process of grieving? Just out of curiosity. Because I will answer that, and then I'll tie it into why I ask.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think I'm excited to see how you tie it into what you're going to ask later. But it, having my son has changed everything, and everything about who I thought I was has changed. And I think the idea of family and what family means has changed now that I've had my son. I come from a very small family. My parents, like I said, divorced, and so my idea of family was very small and wasn't, mom, dad side of the family combined. It was very separated, and I have family members that I haven't seen in decades. Whereas my husband's family is very close, but they're large family, and that is something completely foreign to me. Having my son, um, he everything is about him, and
Yes.
so every loss that I experience, I think of it as a loss for him, and I think it's more intense. The loss, I guess I can kind of stuff the loss deep down somewhere and move forward. But when I experience the loss that I think is a loss that extends to him, that's really hard, and that's what I'm kind of learning how to adapt to as a new mom. That I've never had to really consider someone else's life so much other than my own, and that everything that happens will affect him. So it's made the process more intense.
Yeah, man. Yeah, I'm not a parent, but what an interesting way of looking at that. It's you're taking on the grief of two people right now. Um, I did not expect you to go that route, to be honest with you. I was going to tie it in a different way. Um, but yeah, I can totally see how you would do that because you are suffering for your son who doesn't understand the suffering that you not necessarily suffering, but the concept of it yet. Um,
Mhm.
and it's the yeah, man. Sorry to hear that.
I think it's similar to what my father experienced for the loss of, my family structure with the divorce, that I didn't see it, I didn't know at the time. And I think he felt that grief for my brother and I, initially, similarly. So I think that I understand also from being a parent, my father struggles a lot more than I did before becoming a parent too.
Yeah. Well, that's why it's so crucially important to check in on the parents too to see where they
Absolutely.
are and how they're doing because
Yeah.
if they're suffering and they're putting it aside because they are now shouldering the responsibility of the suffering of their child, um,
Mhm.
and then at the same time trying to be this rock or this stability for them, it's important to check in on the parents as well. So no, what I was going to do with it was I had this weird. It could also be a compound of where I'm at in my life, a byproduct of where I'm at in my life as well. I'm 35 years old. I have no children. Um, and it's something that I've kind of went back and forth on. I'm just like, if it happens, it happens. I work. I'm a school teacher, so I'm constantly surrounded by children. So I definitely am very happy to come home to a quiet home and not have the loud noises follow me where I go. But I oddly, oddly, and I don't know why, and I don't know if you've ever heard this, but like just had this dire desire to have a child. Like wish I had a child to hold, to nurture, to like within the coming days after my grandfather. It was just the oddest thing. It was one of those oddities where I was like, why do I have this extreme, desire to have a child or a baby, an infant in my hand to like just cuddle and love? And I think a lot of it is probably how I wanted to be felt in that moment. I wanted to be, I don't know, maybe I'm deep psychoanalyzing my own self here, but like a lot of that felt to me like I wish I just had that. Or maybe, they talk about pets and how the important role that they play and how
Mhm.
they can, help somebody, if, especially a lot of these veterans or a lot of these people that might live on their own that might have
Yeah.
pets, they do serve a purpose and are comforting during those times. So maybe it's more of that route and it's not as necessarily as deep as me needing a child. But do you find that odd? Is that not a strange thing that you've heard, or have you heard something like that before?
I don't find it odd. It takes a lot for me to say something is odd in my line
I'm
of
sure it
work.
does.
So I've heard a lot, but no, that actually is without also going really depth in the analysis of that. But no, I don't find that odd at all, and I think that um, with death in particular, it's kind of coming face to face with our own mortality. And when you lose someone close to you like that, you realize that this doesn't go on forever, and that time is we're here for a finite period of time, and we don't know when that will end. And so, children can be symbolic of um, you know the new generation passing along, and um, I don't know if that had anything to do with what your experience was on some level, but who knows? But yeah, no, it's not strange. And, I think death has a really profound impact on people in many ways. And that may be something that it kind of uncovered for you in that moment or, in the future. It's hard to say, but no, it's not strange.
Well, I appreciate you make me feel better by
You're welcome.
not saying it's strange. Um, I want to ask you. I saw a conversation on YouTube. I was rabbit trailing. Um, what I've actually discovered about me was that I think I am so busy, Alex, putting so many things in my day. Um, and especially when the initial death happened of my grandfather, it was December 6th, and I still had another couple weeks of school. I did take my bereavement time. The school was great with that. I didn't do more than I should, but I am somebody who's constantly going, constantly going. So my mind is constantly in 10 different places at once. And what I found was that once this kind of the smoke settled and everything after the funeral, and it was kind of over, it felt like a day or two would go by, and I'm never not thinking about it, but the
Hmm.
level of grieving is different. And then all of a sudden you're triggered by something and you're just
Yeah.
in it, right? And you know that, and as everybody I'm sure does, there's anything and everything that could trigger it, and you can't avoid the world, so you just have to go with it. Um, but I found myself purposely, and I'm still doing this, and I'm like okay with it. I'm diving into my grief, especially if I've gone a couple days where it doesn't feel as it was heavy or as intense. And I don't know if this is healthy, but I will seek out um, triggers. And I don't know why I'm doing that, but I oddly find some sense of like if I lose that intensity, I and I need to come to peace with this. I know I do, but like if I lose the intensity of that level of grief, I feel guilty.
Yeah, that's the word that came to my mind as soon as you were hesitating. I
You knew
said
where I was
there's
going with it.
guilt. Yeah. Yeah.
And I don't think that that should be the way I do this, because I know that at any moment's notice, something could trigger me to that. And it's okay for me to live my life and all of that. But like, I'm purposely doing it because I don't know. I want to, stay connected to that intensity for still. I'm just not ready to let that go for as long as I possibly can. And so I transitioned into this. It's going somewhere. So I got on to YouTube, and there was this great conversation between Anderson Cooper and Stephen Colbert. And I don't know if you're a YouTube junkie where you've seen this conversation or not at all, but it was a 20-minute conversation on grief. And there were
Mm.
so many things said in that 20 minutes. And I kind of want to, there was a lot of different ideas and topics. Um, First of all, have you seen what I'm talking about just off top?
No, unfortunately
Okay.
not. I'm gonna check it out after we
Yeah,
finish. Yeah.
check it out. I think it'd be worth. It's just an honest conversation, which is what we're doing right now, and I'm thoroughly enjoying this. But there was this idea in the beginning of the conversation about people tend to either do one of two things. They either avoid somebody when they're grieving
Mm.
because you're afraid that just by saying simply "I'm sorry" might trigger their good day into a bad day, right? Um, and then there's those that like to share their grief with other people. Both are probably fine. Both are probably healthy. But like I've found that I do enjoy talking about it. I do enjoy diving into it. Do you find that it's healthy to dive into your grief, or do you think that I'm traveling down an unhealthy path? Or is it not necessarily me, but just like in people in general too? I mean, is this on in your experience? Do you find that people, you know, do the latter, which I'm talking about?
So yeah, I mean, grief, like I said earlier, grief looks different for everyone, and everyone's process is what their process is. And, for you specifically, it seems like this is a process, this part of your process is important. And, there's grieving a loss of grief, which sounds kind of strange, but the process of going through grief is keeping something active, right? And you had mentioned feeling guilty if you don't feel that grief. And,
Right.
I've read somewhere that really struck me as a really interesting point to think of grief as love. And, love for a person after you lose them doesn't necessarily go away, and neither does grief. And so there really can be a process that you go through where you are grieving the loss of the intensity of that connection and that really intense grieving process, because it's like my grief keeps this person present in some way.
Yeah.
So I don't think it's unhealthy. I think it's a way of coping with that loss, as is either avoidance or sharing the experience. Those are also coping mechanisms for it. um and of course, coping mechanisms can be healthier or less than healthy. And I tend to think that sharing and going through that process is a healthy way to cope with grief and to process that loss. So I can't say that you're going down a specific path or not, but I do think that it is healthy to share and um, to be open with people that you feel are a good support system for you. And people do avoid grieving people because really it's like, what do you say?
Right.
What do you say to someone who's had a tremendous loss? There
Right.
really isn't anything that can not sound really trivial or cliche, other than sitting there with the emotion that they have, which is really intense. If you've ever tried to sit with someone's emotion rather than talking to them, that's intense. And it's hard.
Yeah, it is. You said something that, and I've been putting this on Facebook the last couple weeks. Um, uh, it kind of goes along with what you were saying. Grief is love, and in this case, what really, it's probably the most profound quote that I've seen so far. Grief is love with just no place to go. It's this idea that you have all of this unexpressed love that you want to give to your person, and they can't receive it. Um, and yet it bottles up inside of you and it becomes a part of you in some way, and you want to share it and you just can't. And then that's when you're triggered by all of those things that come with it. So, but you said something that was interesting to me. It's grieving the grief, the loss of grief. And that's, I think that's probably right. I think that's probably where I'm at, is that I dive into those because I'm worried, right? I'm worried that I will lose this intense connection that has been so prevalent in my life. Um, because I, and I'm sure you've heard this before too, but for me, when my grandfather died, I felt like that was the end of my youth. That was the end of
Hmm.
my, I felt like
Yeah.
my childhood had died. Um, I felt reborn, but not in like this clean, refresh, fresh start type of way like people seek, through like baptism and things like that. I felt like I was reborn into a world that I didn't really want to be a part of. And I still feel that way. I still have this thing, and I put a video out yesterday promoting today's show about I'm oddly feel purposeless in a weird way. And this is the thing that's kind of most confusing to me, because I didn't realize, and I'm not sure as I kind of dissect myself, and I'm not looking for you to dissect me, but like I'm just kind of sharing with you some of the things that I've felt here over the last month or so, or the last couple of weeks, is that I've oddly felt purposeless because I've been connecting all of my successes and all of my pursuits in my life to simply sharing with him, to see a certain reaction or joy come across his face that I think is the hardest part, um, that I didn't realize was connected, Alex. I had no idea that that was something I was going to feel, but I do. And it's kind of made things lose status. And I don't know your experiences with that kind of thought process, but it's kind of where I'm at right now. I feel
Yeah.
reborn and things don't hold status like they used to. And I'm kind of trying to live in this world now.
Yeah, that's an interesting, you had mentioned that everything, I'm kind of paraphrasing, but everything that you've done was for his approval and reaction to everything for you. And that loss of the approval, it can feel like you're lost, almost not knowing whether you're doing well or not, whether what you're doing is, a good thing or not, without him as your anchor. It sounds like he was an anchor for you. But I think that part of grief and the whole process of grief is the acceptance, and then like the process after that is like moving forward. You don't have to forget, you don't lose that grief, that love, but it's moving forward in a different type of world, a different world without this person. But also being able to be that anchor for yourself, and whatever you learned from your grandfather, to carry that with you. It's not that you lose that. You may lose the being, right? The figure, the person, but that doesn't mean that everything is lost, and it's not all or nothing. Just like grief isn't all or nothing, black or white. It's
Right.
that person you carry that with you. And so yeah, the world is different without him, of course, absolutely. And doesn't mean that it has to be less than it was with him. It can be different. And you can transfer that onto yourself, and provide yourself with the structure and anchor and validation that he gave you.
Do you, going back to a previous statement that you had made about how you feel that when people are grieving, obviously people are going to grieve in their own way, and that's just the way it is. That's the process, and that's what you have to dive into, is what your process is. Um,
Hmm.
when does grief become unhealthy?
Great
That's
question.
I guess maybe too vague a question, but like,
It's not.
when
It's
do
actually
you look at it and say that last stage of acceptance? Because I feel like I'm in acceptance, but like I also feel like I'm participating and holding on to this. Like maybe I'm not. Maybe others would know better than me, but like um, I do think that if I was to participate in something like this of that nature too long, could be very unhealthy. And I just wonder, when does it become unhealthy? Not just for me, but in general. When do you tend to have a different conversation with your patients or of people that might be seeking your counsel?
Yeah, so that's actually a great question, and that is the most common question that, I hear actually with grief is when has it become more than grief? And grief is a normal process, right? We call it normal bereavement, right? Bereavement is that process of going through that loss. And bereavement can progress, and it can become what we call complex bereavement, and then that can continue to become major depression. And so it becomes, um, when the grieving process and the loss is so intense that you become worthless, you feel worthless, hopeless, life isn't worth living anymore. Obviously suicidal, that could bring, gets to a whole other level. But when the feeling of that loss becomes so intense to the point where you now feel hopeless, worthless, and you're starting to have the symptoms of major depression, um, sadness, loss of interest, low energy, not really engaging with what you were previously doing in your life. And so that would be more pathological, in that process, because as much as we grieve, it typically shouldn't cross over into a complete withdrawal from your life or anything like that. Um, in a healthy grieving process. And so grief can cross over to pathology and become major depression. And so that's when you're starting to exhibit the signs of major depression. That's when I would say the grief has crossed over to a different conversation, as you put it.
As a as a the person giving counsel on that, do you is there like a sense of urgency on your end when you can kind of see the pathology taking place and you're like, oh, I don't, we might be too far gone now to get them back quickly, or I don't know if that's even possible, but you kind of see where I'm going with it. Do you Is there different techniques and practices that you then have to kind of transition into like more of a tougher love, or is that those things just not capable in your world, because just because you say something doesn't mean they're going to get there, right? So what do you find usually generally kind of keeps them from tipping over that edge, so to speak?
Um, there are a lot of factors that go into tipping over that edge, and a lot of it is social factors, environmental factors. Genetics plays a big portion of that. And so whether someone is predisposed to becoming depressed or not genetically, that will play a part. And so there, with grief, when someone experiences a loss and I'm, aware and present with them in the beginning of that, or right after that loss, or even before and that imminent loss, or inevitable loss, um, I'm a huge advocate for psychotherapy and counseling, in addition to medications. And so I'm having that conversation with people, um, hopefully before they're in a depressive episode or it's progressed. I never really think that it's beyond help, or it's too late or anything like that. I think the treatment is different at that at that level of severity, of course. But I'm talking about counseling with that, if it's a long-term loss, right? Or if it's a decline that people are watching a family member decline or become more sick, that's like an ongoing, prolonged grieving process. And then when they die, that's not the beginning of the grief, right? They've been grieving this whole time. So
Right.
I'm looking at like, okay, how do we get you support through this process? And then how do you get support with whatever emotions present themselves after that loss? And some people find one of those emotions that they feel guilt is relief. And so in that process where it's a long-term decline, that that can present a lot of different ways. But I'm talking about counseling from a very early stage in this, and that doesn't mean that it's because it's pathological grief. It's because it's helpful to have that support, and it can potentially um, create a different path to that complex bereavement or the major depression. And hopefully, the hope is that it prevents a major depression from occurring, and it doesn't always, but that's the hope. So it's more of what I'm trying to say is it's more of an ongoing and preventative if possible. And if not, you get them into counseling as soon as possible if they're willing. So it's never too late.
For sure. And I'm always curious with in your world, because there's patient doctor confidentiality. Yes, what they say to you stays with you, or no? Am I in a different field here?
No, you're right there. Nope.
Okay. So how do you, because you might want to seek counsel on things of, whether or not to give advice to be on medication, right? You start going down those roads, and although you might, um, um, it, let me ask it this way. Do you ever talk with your peers about, like, maybe the general idea, like, when do we start putting out that advice of seeking out medication? Because and do you find that challenging with the confidentiality portion of it, not being able to give so much detail, just the magnitude of having to make those decisions, or give that advice? Because I feel like there would come with stresses of, like, oh my gosh, I'm not sure, because some people might have a more addictive personality, and it might be not the best thing for them, but it also is the best thing for them. I just always look at medication as, like, I try to take the negative stigma off of it, but there's also stigma on it for unruly reasons sometimes. So, like, do you find any added pressure of having to advise people to go on medication? And if so, um, do you tend to seek out counsel yourself of your peers before making that decision, or are you not allowed to?
Yeah. So there is confidentiality that goes along with being a physician across specialties. And I do, and I have many a times, and will continue to seek counsel and input from peers. And it's more of when we do seek that counsel, it's not, patient XYZ is, it's not really a specific, has it's more of a hypothetical, like, what would you do in this situation? And so, or do you think, do you think that, or what am I missing? Or is there, an alternative that I haven't thought of if someone is presenting with XYZ. So it's more of a hypothetical approach because, treatment is not one size fits all. And, what works for someone may not work for another, but it's more of a, how do I manage this concept, and this is what my algorithm is. What else in your algorithm do you have that I may be forgetting or whatever?
Okay.
So yes, I do seek counsel from peers, from superiors, from people I've trained with, and attendings that I worked under as a resident. And so yeah, it's important to do that because you don't know everything, and if you're stuck, that's the best way is to know when you don't know and know when to kind of seek help yourself. Um, Medications is it's a decision that is ultimately the patient's decision, and it's an option. I don't necessarily seek counsel every time I decide to pursue or offer a medication, but um, that's a decision and a conversation, a very open, collaborative conversation with my patient of all of the options, not just medication. Medication is always one option for the most part. One option of many. And so it's something that I present as an option, not the only option. And sometimes it, in my opinion, may be the option that gives them the best chance for a recovery, but there's also risk associated. And so as long as they're making that informed decision, that's really the key is them choosing what they think is best out of the options. And so it's really a collaborative approach. Yeah. I don't know
Yeah,
if that's
that's
answered,
a
but
That's a really great answer to a really dumb question. I sometimes forget the oversimplifying of the when you've had as many conversations with your patients as you've had, you guys have
Mhm.
built a relationship, and I forget the how much easier it is in that moment when you're having an open conversation with somebody to suggest things of that nature. Not necessarily suggest, but to put them on the table as options, which is what you do. Um, as you were answering, I'm like, I wish I had 5 minutes ago and just take it back, but you'd answered it very, very eloquently.
No, it's a
I wanted to, because we've only got about 20 minutes left, Alex. And I just, again, thank you for being on the show. This has been everything I wanted it to be. I think it's been great. A lot of good things come from it for me personally, and I'm sure through conversations, others will grasp many things from this as well. Um, I'm going to ask you something very personal now.
sure.
And I by no means am I showing my hand on this. I'm just asking you a question. Um, are you a person of faith?
That's an interesting question. I don't know how to answer that.
Well,
Um,
and you
yeah.
don't have to. You don't
No,
have
I
to.
I'm going to answer it.
But here's where I'm going with it.
Mhm.
Um, at the end of the Anderson Cooper Stephen Colbert special that they did, something interesting was said by Stephen Colbert. Um, Anderson Cooper asked him. He said that Stephen was once quoted saying, "What punishments of God are not gifts?" And
Hmm.
his reason for saying that, he asked Stephen Colbert if he actually believes that because Colbert was quoted saying that, and he said that Stephen Colbert responded with, "Yes, I do believe that all punishments of God are gifts." And his reason is for that is because if you accept God, you accept life as a gift. And everything that comes with life, the good and the bad, is a gift of being on the other side now where you get to help others grieve and being a part of their grieving process. And he's a very intelligent man. Um, he's just this idea of being grateful for God. So the reason I'm tying it into asking if you're a person of faith is because do you tend to approach patients differently who might be a person of faith, who might have their idea of um, the end game or the way they approach something? And do you find it challenging to kind of take in who they are as a person, their belief system, and still provide the type of guidance and counsel that you think is best for them? Do you pander to their thoughts, or do you stay true to Alex or Dr. Jens and give them what you believe? How does that work? Because I know that can be a kind of a tricky area as well.
And I think that's what as you were asking your question, I was thinking, why did I hesitate to answer? And because I think you know, as a psychiatrist, I have been and am in the process of developing my way of self-disclosure. And so I tend to have this kind of neutrality that I bring to the table, and that has pros and cons to it. And so, in when you're talking about grief, that's very personal, and it's hard to be neutral in that kind of a topic with your patient. But it's also how far do you self-disclose before it's no longer helpful for the patient.
Right.
Um, and
Where do you
so,
draw that line, right? You know what I mean? Yeah, that's a very
yeah,
tricky balance because some
it is.
patients might not feel connected if you don't self-disclose at some elements. So
Exactly. And so, and it's also as because I'm a psychiatrist, but, person underneath that hat. And what is my comfort level with that amount of self disclosure with my patient? Um, and so, with asking, am I a person of faith? I think that in and of itself is not a straightforward question or answer rather for me, because that's also varied at different parts of my life or at different stages in my life, is my faith or my commitment to faith versus whether I consider myself religious, and I'm going to put that in air quotes, religious or not. Um, but I think the more important question is, or the more important point in that is not whether I have faith or not, but is whether I can bring my patient's faith into consideration for their overall treatment. And I think that that's what I ultimately strive to do, is to bring what's important to them into the mix, because if I'm not, my treatment approach is very limited, right? If they don't
Right.
have to it, if it's against what their beliefs are, then it's useless.
Right.
And so I have to be I have to be educated enough in people's differences to be able to understand the impact of what something like a loss means for them and a family, and what their philosophy, what is their religious or spiritual philosophy or understanding of death, right? I need to know that, or else like my approach could not land, or could have no significance for them if it's not in line with what their understanding is of death. So I think understanding where my patients lie on that, in that realm, is more important than me bringing my faith to it. Of course, we all have our boundaries, and certainly we're not expected as physicians to do something against our personal beliefs, but I try to actually remain neutral from that perspective while trying to understand where they're coming from. I think that that's been an approach that's worked the best for me. Um, and I can't say that I offer religious based counseling, because I don't, but I also am well aware of options for religious focused counseling if that's what they're looking for. So I always present it as an option if that's something that is important to them, because I think it's just as valid as medications or anything else.
Man, it sounds like you have to constantly walk the tightrope and just balance everything. And you're doing it so eloquently here. You're doing it with such grace. Is that I've put you in a position, Alex, to be Alex Rush, the person. Dr. Jen's the professional. We're talking about grief, which is very personal, like you said, and yet I ask you questions such as your religion. Um, you are doing a very good job navigating in and out in between both worlds. So I just wanted you to know that you're doing a fantastic job there. Uh,
Thank you.
I only got a few minutes left here, about 12 minutes. Um, I had a couple other questions I'd like to venture down because we've been really heavy into the grief area. I just, um, now my life has transitioned to a point where I have, um, before my grandfather died, my grandmother and him they've been married for 46 years. And he was already in late stages, the last stage of Parkinson's. Um, and then, so he was a large man as far as presence and as far as physical nature. He was 260 and in his heyday, probably 6'1", 6'2". So he was a big physical being. And um, it became harder and harder for my grandmother to take care of him. So the last week before his passing, I kind of went into the house and started helping, transitioning from chair to scooter, or from the upstairs to the downstairs. And he was suffering with COVID. Um, so that was also watching his whatever strength he had left in his upper body and his arms, watching that fade. So it was a tough week and tough process. But then experiencing the actual moment of trauma, the phone call that you don't want to get from the hospital, and so on and so on. So we've transitioned to a place where I've actually moved in with my grandmother now.
Mm,
And it's great. This is the second day, and I love her and she loves me, and we are, going to be there for each other, and that's just the way it's going to be. Um,
mm,
but if at all, she's in her mid 70s, Alex, I am going to seek your counsel. I am going to ask for some suggestions or just some things. For any of the elderly out there who have experienced a long life with somebody, to the part where they aren't two individual people, they are a one entity, right?
mhm.
Um, and now half of her feels gone, right? Um, how would you advise when she's ready? What are some things she can do to maybe seek purpose again, find purpose in? What can she do to help get kind of back, not just her, but any elderly couple that might be going through that when they're ready? What are some things they can do to kind of get back on their feet as an elderly person?
That is a really, really important component for that population, elderly people losing a spouse. really doesn't matter how long they've been together, but certainly if it's a long, relationship and you're so much of your identity is wrapped up, is intertwined with that person, that loss is huge. And, I really, I can't stress enough how difficult being a caretaker is. Um, physical, body habitus is one thing, but being a long-term caretaker for a progressive decline such as Parkinson's and then COVID on top of this, um, that has a lot of meaning outside of the illness, but also with the social isolation that COVID has presented us with, in the end stage of someone's life or illness. Social isolation is like the last thing that you would want. And so that the pandemic has certainly put a lot of um, or at least has caused a lot of change to end of life issues with people and how they can have their family involved, unfortunately. And it's heartbreaking, and I've never experienced a pandemic, much like any of us, and I don't know what to advise on that portion of it. But I think um, maximizing social supports is, I think, the biggest thing to do, and arguably the stronger the social support network, the in theory, and this is not absolute, but the less likely of complex, the progression of the bereavement into a pathology such as depression. So the quality of the social support network is really important. And I think that that in and of itself helps kind of re-engage and give purpose and meaning. Um, and it's about kind of redefining yourself in that part of your life as an individual again. And I think that can be really challenging, but um, not impossible. And it's really a matter of strengthening that social support. And you're providing a huge support for your grandmother as she is for you. And you guys are both in different stages of life. And so that's going to be interesting to see what impact the supports you guys provide for each other will have. But and I know that's a vague answer I'm giving you because there
No, it's
isn't,
okay.
yeah, there isn't really a formula for it, more as it's a concept of doing the opposite of withdrawing.
No, I think it was a great answer because you're looking at it's not so much about the things you're doing, it's about building the foundation of identity so that you can get to a place where you're wanting to do those things.
Mhm.
I think that's what I grasped from that, if I understood that correctly. That's what I
Yeah.
take away from there. I am going to ask you to be Alex Rush, though, for a second. And if you can't answer because of we're going to be put in front of some people here tomorrow, and you never know who's going to see this. Um, you had mentioned the unusual circumstances of the end of life and the way we are faced as people now with the pandemic and the way that's changed um, that kind of closure or that final few minutes or days with each other. As a
Mhm.
person, Alex, a person who's studied people and behaviors and what we need, I'll go first. I'll be honest with you. Without tipping my cap one way or other and keeping the politics out of it, I do believe that there is absolutely a necessity that family, and I know that that's a gray area. What's family? Who's family? What gets to be considered family? And I know that's hard for people that have to make tough decisions to grasp. But I think if you can leave it up to, I don't know. Here's my point. I think it's important, especially in a hospital, and this is where I go with it. My grandfather, we were not allowed to go where he was at. He died alone, in my opinion, and that doesn't sit well with me. What frustrates me about that the most is that the moment he died, they called, they told us, and then asked us if we wanted to come see him. And I, I just that process will never ever make sense to me. It was like 1 second he's here, we can't be there. 1 second later he's gone, and now we can be. Um, and I've asked a lot of questions about does the virus die? How does it work? And from my understandings, it's still very much a warm body. It's still very much alive. But neither here nor here there. Just the procedure, or just the what you think people need. Um, do you find that we need to figure something out that's a little bit better so that people can get the closure that they need? Or do you think this is just inevitably the best we can come up with because we don't know? We don't know how to handle this.
Both, if I can be honest. Yeah, so we don't know how to handle this, and um, there isn't a right answer. Unfortunately, there's the hypothetical, answer that we all want, which is to figure out a way. And I don't have the answer to that.
Well,
I
let
know
me
that.
pose it one different way. Let me. I'm sorry I asked you a question, then I cut you off. But like, here's the way I've been looking at it as of late. I choose to smoke. Society says I can do that. That at any moment could cause me to go into a situation where I might have to go into the hospital, right?
Mm,
Um, if I want to take the chance to go into the hospital to see my grandfather, or if my, and to be honest with you, I would have removed myself just so that my grandmother could go because I wouldn't have wanted to go. That's my own personal, unless he wanted me there, I wouldn't want to see him like that. But my
right.
grandmother wanted to be there to hold his hand. And
Mhm.
I think she's warranted that responsibility as a person to walk into a hospital knowing damn well that she might contract the virus. But just as people decide to go and drive over the speed limit, eat fast food, smoke, anything that might cause harm to themselves, they are allowed the opportunity to do that and make those decisions. I'm just at the point now where I think you have to allow somebody, at least one, to not die alone.
Yeah, that is not an easy answer. It's certainly not an easy situation, and uh, unfortunately common with what we're dealing with this pandemic and the limitations that the pandemic has placed on our lives in so many different ways. Um, I think there's a different way to look at it. There's a way of looking at the, individual personal situation, and then there's looking at it from a global greater good
Right.
uh, view. And I think that that's where there's a lot of conflict is looking at it from a personal standpoint versus a greater good. And so, certainly from a personal standpoint, in the patient who is dying and the family members who are grieving that death and ultimately that loss, the best thing is for them to be present with that and to go through that process. However, for the greater good of a global pandemic, that may not be the best option, right? And that's what we're up against. And so there's always a consequence for driving over the speed limit, and the consequence may not be that you, the person driving, die, but that you kill someone else. um, and smoking, you are choosing to smoke, but your secondhand smoke is also coming into contact with someone who is choosing not to. And so I think that that's where this fight and this tension is that the buck doesn't stop with you.
Right.
Fortunately, with the pandemic, there's just implications for, you know, who, does grandma bring in, is she a carrier of COVID, doesn't know it, and does someone who's compromised catch it, right? It's
Yeah.
just so there's so much responsibility from a global perspective to kind of stop this, this thing from spreading worse, but also maintaining some sense of humanity in the process and in the dying process, and some dignity in death, in the dying process, and having people die with dignity is really important. And that isn't happening, and it's really unfortunate, but there isn't an easy solution to that.
Yeah, it's trying to remember that we're human and make human laws make sense. But you're right. It's where does when you're helping one and it could impact another, where does that line exist and when should you cross it, when shouldn't you? So Alex, I've met my match. You are absolutely more intelligent than me on the matter. I gave an analogy there at the end and you poked holes through it. Thank you so much. Um, just quickly, tell me why you went this route in your life, why you felt this was your pursuit, and it's a noble one. You should be proud of yourself, and I know Barry is your husband. is probably proud of you as well. And I'm proud of him. Off this camera, I will tell you what, he was something completely different in college, man. But who he is
You'll have to
now
tell
is,
me some
I mean,
stories.
he was
He's
great, but he was crazy. Um, I'm sure
no,
you've heard, but
I-
just why choose this road for you?
yeah, it's so that is definitely not a simple answer, but in short, my family has dealt with mental illness and in varying degrees, and so I've been exposed to it from a young age. And if you look in my fifth grade yearbook, it asks what I want to be when I grow up, and the answer was a psychologist. So I'm pretty close.
Yeah.
But yeah, yeah. So I went on this path, and it's really I can't see myself doing anything else, honestly. So I think that I chose the right path for me and for my personality, and of course I evolve, but I think my the way that I choose to help people has just really been steady through all of that. And the more I go on, the more I realize how I'm in the right field. And yeah, so that's long story short. It's my family that that brought me to, and they say that every psychiatrist says their family is the reason they're a psychiatrist.
Yeah.
So I will continue that cliche because it is true in my case as well.
That's so funny. That's so funny. Well, I appreciate you coming on the show. You've done great, and I
Having
think this
me.
is going
This
to
was
be a
awesome.
great service to other people. I hope you come back in the future. We're going to be doing and talking, like I said, my goal is to try to do one of these every 4 episodes, just talk about a different topic every
Hmm.
time, as I think we as human beings, we struggle with so many different things, but it's better to talk about those things, to put labels on those things so that it feels more organized and that it also feels like not such an exclusive club, that there's this inclusiveness that comes with all of our problems, that we share more with each other than we don't, and it's okay to talk about. Um,
Yep. You're not
so
alone, and so yeah, that's important to emphasize.
thank you very much. Alex, thank you so much for being on the show. I hope you have a good support system because of the things you're hearing all the time. Just make sure you check in with your mental health and take care of that as well. But we will see you on down the road. And I hope you have a wonderful, great new year and start to your year.
You too. Thank you so much for having me. This was great.
Yep. And we'll see you guys. See you on down the road.